My father had arranged beforehand for my transfer into an all-girls school some 20 minutes from the mansion by car. It was a very prestigious institution. I had actually recognized the name. I felt badly out of place, uncomfortable with my new uniform and the beautiful school building.
ねえ、あの子が。そうよね。Sakaki家の。
I could hear the whispers from all sides. Entering the classroom, I sat quietly at an open desk as far from the others as possible. There was an improvement in one regard. The talk about me wasn't particularly cruel or hostile.
訳ありなのよね。ええ、ちょっとお近づきには。
But essentially, I was treated just like before. My classmates interacted with me in a business-like way when necessary, and otherwise largely pretended I wasn't there. A school full of young ladies from upper-crust families was surprisingly uncomfortable in its own way.
いい天気。
Having completed my formulaic introduction and the first day of classes, I found myself instinctively heading for the rooftop. After gazing up for a moment, I settled down against a concrete support near the edge of the roof and took out my sketchbook. I began to draw the sky above me. A simple pencil hatching, rendering the clouds and sky in shades of gray. That afternoon, I couldn't stand to look at the world. Anything my eyes settled on repulsed me. That empty sky was the only thing I could bring myself to observe calmly. The driver held open the front door to the house for me. I was delivered to school and back. I didn't even have to open my own doors anymore. That extreme courtesy only intensified my discomfort.
お帰りなさいませ。
The household employees greeted me with smiles so soft and mild it was slightly nauseating. When I answered with a brief nod, they began to bombard me with words in rapid succession, their tone eager and openly professional.
由美子様、何か召し上がりますか？いえ、結構です。部屋へ戻ります。
では、何かお飲み物をお持ちしましょうか？
それも結構です。喉は渇いておりませんから。
それでは、何かありましたらお申し付けください。
はい。
You know, it must be strange going from having the bare essentials to having people literally waiting on you hand and foot. Not even having to open your own doors or get your own food. It's quite a culture shock, really. I don't know if I'd like it. It seemed too needy, you know? Like I can make my own sandwich. Climbing slowly up the stairs, I heaved a heavy sigh. Would they be putting that sort of show every single day from now on? Their deference was so transparently artificial that it was painful rather than flattering. Given my current position, it just might be possible to order them to stop acting like that. But I didn't know what repercussions that would have, especially if they were to report it to my father. I ended up deciding it would be best not to make waves at such an early stage. I'd been able to postpone it for one day with excuses about my fatigue, but the time had come.
久しぶりだね。こうして由美子と食事をとるのは。
Yeah, what's his deal? You know, he had acted like we didn't even exist, and now all of a sudden he was a loving father wanting to provide for his daughter. Something happened. A glass of wine in one hand, my father turned a radiant smile on me.
Hi.
Inside my head, I spat out the words, "It's the first time." From the moment I sat down in front of that luxurious dinner and my beaming father, I was immediately filled with a desperate longing to flee. I tried a little of the sautéed duck on my plate just to kill a few seconds, but it seemed strangely tasteless and without texture.
学園の先生から褒められたよ。転入する際の成績が抜群だったとね。これなら学校間のレベル差はほとんど関係ないとのことだった。
My father, still maintaining the same cheerful tone as the night before, complimented me at great length.
Hi.
All I could manage was to nod and mechanically shovel the food placed in front of me into my mouth. Course after course, and I couldn't taste a thing. Had they even put any salt on these? It was like eating hunks of rubber. Carrying things to my mouth solely for the sake of chewing on them didn't make for a pleasant dining experience. Gradually, I began to ignore my plate in favor of frequent sips of water.
気持ち悪い。
The tasteless food, Dad's barrage of praise, and myself, sitting there passively just accepting it all. Everything about the scene made me sick. My emotions only grew darker with every passing minute. This was all some bizarre whim of my father's, that, or a meaningless ceremony was carrying out in pursuit of some hidden objective. What else could it possibly be?
Yumiko, 髪はずっと伸ばしているのか?
I felt my breath catch in my throat. That summer day, the day when the heat had poured down on me like a rain of molten iron. The moment when I had clawed at my chest and hacked at my own hair in a spasm of self-loathing. It all came flooding vividly back.
はい。
I almost told him that I'd cut it short once. But what would be the point of explaining that to this man? It would only throw this little play into chaos. What on earth did my father mean by asking me a question like that? Why bring up the very thing that has always marked me as worthless?
そうか。とてもよく似合ってるよ。
My father's smile on his face spoke those words in a casual tone of voice. Oh gosh.
Yumiko.
すみません。
Rising from my seat, I ran out of the room, both hands pressed tightly across my mouth.
おい、何か体に合わないものがあったんじゃないのか?
I could hear my father snarling at someone behind me, but I didn't have the time to be worrying about that. Acid burned my mouth as I vomited the tasteless food out into the toilet bowl. None of it had the slightest flavor going down, but coming back up it was powerfully unpleasant. It seemed a bit unfair somehow.
何を勝手なこと。
Wasn't my sex the entire reason he'd cast Mom aside? What on earth was my father thinking? How could he say that? Why? He never even looked at me before. This had to be some kind of whim. He decided to play house for a while to appease his guilty conscience. Either that, or he needed to do so for some work-related reason.
ここもひどい。
How long would it take before I could find a safe haven? This was no better than living with my grandparents. No. In the countryside, at least I wasn't expected to do anything. There were expectations of me here that made it even more agonizing.
何もしたくないのに。
Tasting the acid rising once more from the depths of my throat, I descended into self-pity. I would truly have preferred to shut myself up in a dark shed, to reject the world and do nothing at all for the rest of my life. But so long as I needed food to eat and a bed to sleep in, I had no choice but to play along with Father's momentary kindness. The thought triggered a new wave of nausea. Oh man. One week had passed. People often say that time flies when you're having fun. And perhaps it's true because the first 7 days seemed to last a century. Hanging my bag next to my desk, I pulled out my notes and textbooks. I was as isolated and out of place as ever in my new school. I'd been studying a good deal, but that was simply my way of killing the vast stretches of otherwise painfully empty time I spent here. It certainly had nothing to do with my father's praise. I hadn't sketched for a few days now. For one thing, the weather had been dull and gray, so I couldn't look out without remembering that day. And I just hadn't been in the mood in the first place. Even if I opened my sketchbook today, I'd only end up with another drawing of the sky. As if I didn't have enough of those already, right? And those vaguely self-mocking thoughts stopped me on the way up to the roof, redirecting my path down to the lower floor. My life was a steady line from one meaningless moment to the next. Identical days trickled by. But there was one thing that had begun to change in the course of that week. Human beings are frighteningly adaptable creatures. The meals with my father that had at first repulsed me to the point of vomiting were gradually growing tolerable. Sometimes I hated myself for that. But little by little, I was coming to understand that it wasn't just the result of my mind acclimatizing myself to the situation. I apologize. Some words I struggle with.
Yumiko, 学校には慣れたか?
はい。
いきなりの転校で戸惑ったかもしれんが、すぐに友達もできる。お父さんの時もだな。
My father was making a genuine offer. With gentle advice and anecdotes about his own experiences, he tried to reassure me. Apparently, Dad had gone through many transfers in his student years and always struggled with how to present himself to his new classmates. I was beginning to learn a number of surprisingly personal things about my father as he persistently tried to draw me into a conversation.
ああ、そうか。今は時代も違うだろうからな。すまなかったな、ユミコ。
He seems nice enough, but what's his ulterior motive, you know? Like, why? Why all of a sudden, you know? Man, I guess we'll find out. That's the whole point of the game, right?
Yeah.
And he wasn't pushy or arrogant about it. He always seemed to be considering my point of view. Just as I'd heard, Dad was on an extremely tight schedule. Even when he returned home, it was extremely rare for him to stay overnight. More frequently, he would return to his company immediately after dinner. But that also meant he was coming home solely to share a meal with me. I gradually grew less prickly and slightly more communicative. By now, I could eat dinner with him without a hint of queasiness.
どうしたユミコ?
いえ、なんでも。
She seems to come out and ask him why. Just as something was about to spill out of my mouth, Mom's pale, empty face had flashed before my eyes. I silently reminded myself, this man is responsible for my mother's suffering. That fundamental resentment hadn't faded. I wouldn't let it fade, oh no. Lying in bed in my darkened room, I thought things over. I was no less uncertain than when I first arrived at that place, but the reason for that inner turmoil were beginning to change. My father's attitude toward me was becoming harder to process. At first, I'd simply been disgusted by his over-familiarity. But by that point, it was harder to dismiss as some bizarre game. Sometimes I could almost take his friendliness at face value. Even that remark about my hair might have been intended as nothing more than a casual compliment. Such positive interpretations were beginning to seem plausible. I tried mumbling negative words to myself, but the nagging doubts remained. My distant mother had grown kind when her condition improved. The situation was clearly different, but there was always the possibility my father had undergone a similar change in the years since I'd last seen him last. Tossing and turning in my bed, I turned the questions over in my mind. I'd been so cold for so long, but little by little I could feel something like warmth returning to my body. I'll just end up being betrayed again. This time will be different. With two opposing answers battling indecisively in my mind, I waited for dawn to come. Three months after my return to Tokyo, my life was beginning to change even outside of the house. School didn't seem particularly unpleasant anymore. It wasn't so difficult being alone in that place once you got used to it. So long as I quietly attended my classes, the entire day would pass easily enough. I never disliked studying, so once my mood took a turn for the better, it didn't feel like wasted time. The change in the seasons had brought more periods of clear weather. I had resumed my habit of drawing on a daily basis. As my mind grew calm, my art slowly began to change as well. My perspective, pointed straight up for so long, began to creep downward. Every once in a while, I'd include a townscape or two among my sketches. It wasn't exactly principled of me to be finding enjoyment in that life, but there was no point sulking forever, right? My sardonic feelings of self-reproach slowly faded. I began to look at the world around me more calmly.
お帰りなさいませ。
ただいま。
Even those brutally awkward interactions with the household employees had gotten more tolerable in the passage of time. After a few weeks, they picked up on my non-reactions and began to tone down their aggressive approach. They would generally back off after letting me know they were available if I needed them. That arrangement was much more comfortable for me. By then, I actually was asking them for something every once in a while.
今日は部屋へすぐ戻られますか？ええ、そのようにします。かしこまりました。
After asking the maid to have someone call me when it was time for dinner, I returned to my room. Sitting down in front of my desk, I thought back over the last few months. My attitudes towards that new life were beginning to soften in many ways. The one exception, I was stubbornly continuing to keep my father at arm's length. His behavior hadn't changed. He continued to treat me kindly all the while. Nonetheless, I offered him nothing but brief monosyllabic answers, vaguely avoiding his questions. That had seemed only natural at first. What else could he expect after he treated my mother? After abandoning me for years? That resentment seemed to justify my behavior. But months had passed, and I couldn't see any sign of the cruel man I thought he was. At least not when he was interacting with me. Nearly every night I rejected his gentle attempts to draw me into conversation. My father didn't seem to be letting that bother him, but I was beginning to feel increasingly guilty about my own attitude.
どうしたらいいのかしら。
I threw the question up at the ceiling, knowing all too well that no answer would be forthcoming. It would be time for dinner soon, for a very different reason than before. I started to find that time somewhat painful.
今日も由美子の話題が出てな。榊さんのお嬢さんは可愛くて聡明でいらっしゃると、目黒医大の先生もおっしゃってたよ。
はい。
由美子がこんなにいい子に育って、父さんも嬉しいよ、本当に。
This man had interacted with me as something close to an ideal father for 3 straight months. That day, as always, all that came out of his mouth were words of praise and concern for me. Uneasy feelings smoldered away quietly inside my chest.
なあ、由美子。
My father spoke to me in a kind tone of voice, as he always did. I couldn't endure his gaze. I found myself hanging my head.
由美子。
I didn't dislike being praised, not at all. He was making time in an extremely busy life for me. I wasn't yet cynical enough to dismiss that. Sometimes I felt myself on the verge of being grateful.
ごめんなさい。
But no, not yet. That black grime was still inside me. There was always that other emotion struggling against my guilt. So long as that remained, I would never allow myself to get any closer to my father.
母さんのことか。
Duh. I felt myself twitch with surprise. Until that point, I had deliberately steered clear of that particular topic. I had assumed my father was intentionally avoiding it as well, so the turn of the conversation came as a real shock.
話して良いものかずっと迷っていたが、ちゃんと話さないと由美子も納得してはくれないということなんだろうな。
そんな、私は。
いいんだ。これは父さんが悪かったんだ。
My father slowly began to speak. He spoke about his feelings toward my mother, how it felt when she left, and behind everything, the constant stress his incredibly demanding job had placed on their marriage. Everything my father told me turned my image of him completely on its head.
二人が出て行った時、本当に辛かったよ。連れ戻しに行こうって何度も思った。
Why now?
でも仕事に追われてそれができなかった。
In time, my increasingly isolated father began to seek comfort. He admitted that the affair described in the magazine article had happened at that time.
父さんも寂しかったんだ。会社でもいろいろとあって、いけないことと知りつつも、母さんを裏切るようなことをしてしまった。雑誌に記事が出たと聞いたとき、一番に考えたのは、母さんを巻き込んではいけないということだったんだ。それで弁護士を向かわせたんだが。
It was consistent. The actions that had seemed so inhumanly cruel at the time could also be explained by my father's story. After all, that lawyer never got the chance to speak with my mother. There was no proof he'd been sent to serve her with divorce papers. But, even so...
Yumiko.
My father looked straight at my face from across the table. I couldn't help myself, and I returned his gaze. At some point, I'd forgotten even to avert my eyes.
お父さんを許してくれないか?
It was a gentle voice. I'd begun to think I would never hear a voice like that ever again from anyone. And yet it was coming to me from him, the person whose acceptance, in a way, I'd always wanted most. Many thoughts flooded into my head in a confused manner. Those words were more than powerful enough. My fragile defensive wall had finally sprung a leak.
ごめんなさい。
Yumiko.
ごめんなさい、お父さん。ちょっと、私。
I stood from my chair, turned away from that concerned face, and hurried out to the hallway. Halfway covering my face with my right hand, I stumbled up the stairs as best I could. On the way up, I caught a glimpse of a servant staring at me in shock, but I wasn't composed enough to pay that any mind. The world was growing hazy before I even reached my floor. And the instant I closed the door to my room behind me, the tears came pouring down my face. One drop stained the ivory carpet beneath my feet, then another.
お父さん、あんなこと。
It was hard to understand. I couldn't reconcile the man with the vicious, vulgar person the magazines described. There were so many things about him that confused me. But I couldn't believe he'd spoken those words for show. It sounded as if they'd come from the heart. Just as Mom had come to regret the cruel things she said to me, perhaps his dad was simply trying to make up for his mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Looking at it from that angle, it wouldn't be so hard to accept his apology, right?
いいのかな。ねえ、お母さん。
I had one photograph of my mother left, safe in the memory of my mobile phone. But as always, her face was turned to the side and I couldn't read her expression.
今度こそ、幸せになっても。
My life had been shades of gray for so very long. Little by little, I could see colors beginning to emerge. It was a pleasant feeling, like Pleasantville, if you've seen that movie. That was a good movie. And alrighty, I think that'll be enough for today's episode, and I will see you all tomorrow. Same time, same place. Have a good day.